Hello everyone and welcome back to Real Life Struggles. We're back today with the NW Creation Network looking at their second video. In this video, they're going to try to prove the Earth is young. Will their evidence hold up or is it easily debunked? It doesn't. Scientifically, there's only two things that are possible. Number one is that the universe is around 14 billion years old. This is what we get when we examine all of the available evidence. Number two, it might be even older. We have no idea what happened before the Big Bang. We have no idea how long the material that made up the Big Bang was here before it Big Banged. Theologically, the age of the universe and Earth means nothing. It doesn't change the fact that man sinned and is in need of a Savior. I did end up cutting a lot of this video out. I mean, the Young Earth Creation crowd has probably heard everything. If you're not Young Earth Creationists and you want to see the entire video, I do have a link down there. Anyway, I wanted to keep this video short so that people watch it. Let's just look at the core of what's there.
Natural science teaches that the world is 4.6 billion years old and teach it as though it's an absolute fact.
It's as close as you can get to calling it a fact without calling it a fact. People want to see science, not pseudoscience. I would be rightfully called out if I started claiming the Earth was flat and the moon was made out of cheese.
Well, where do they get this from? Especially when there are literally hundreds of physical processes that set an upper limit on the age of the Earth that is less than a billion years.
They get it from studying evidence and testing hypotheses. Hypothesize? I'm not sure what the plural of hypothesis is. And then it becomes an accepted scientific theory. These processes you speak of have already been debunked by multiple people, sometimes even me on this very own channel. This is easy because they rely on faulty assumptions, faulty evidence, or sometimes just outright lying.
Again, they're cherry picking the data that supports their worldview and excluding data that does not.
That's funny because Young Earth Creationists do this and proudly post it on their website under their statement of beliefs. Any evidence contrary to their very narrow interpretation of the Bible is not even considered. I have never heard of scientists hiding evidence. They reject Young Earth Creationism because of the massive lack of evidence. In fact, I know that science tries to disprove itself in order to make sure that their theories are credible.
Well, when secular scientists talk about absolute dates of things, of geologic epochs, for example, like the Jurassic period, their measurements for determining such dates come almost exclusively from what is called radiometric dating. Let me explain in brief what radiometric dating is.
I have a feeling he'll get this incredibly wrong, or his critique of it will be incredibly wrong.
Now, radioactivity or radiation is the spontaneous emission of particles from unstable atoms that are disintegrating. And this dating technique uses the decay rates of these radioactive atoms to assign dates to rock.
So far, so good.
But this technique has many problems and numerous unsupported assumptions, including we don't know the original amount of parent material that was there. We don't know the amount of daughter material that might have been there originally. We don't know if the decay rate has been constant. We don't know if it's has been a closed system or has been subject to contaminations of parent material or daughter material. Lots of problems.
Radiometric dating has worked well since it was invented. All right, the following information is kind of long, so I'm just going to read it off the screen. This all comes from one very helpful website called Talk Origins. I've left a link to what I've used down in the description. Isochron methods do not assume that the initial parent or daughter concentrations are known. In basic radiometric dating, a parent isotope, call it P, decays to a daughter isotope D at a predictable rate. The age can be calculated from the ratio of the daughter isotope to parent isotope in a sample. However, this assumes that we know how much of the daughter isotope was in the sample initially. It also assumes that neither isotope entered or left the sample. With isochron dating, we also measure a different isotope of the same element as the daughter, call it D2. And we take measurements of several different minerals that formed at the same time from the same pool of materials. Instead of assuming a known amount of daughter isotope, we only assume that the D2 is initially the same in all of the samples. Plotting P over D2 on the x-axis and d over d2 on the y-axis for several different samples gives a line that is initially horizontal. Over time, as p decays to d, the line remains straight, but its slope increases. The age of the sample can be calculated from the slope, and the initial concentration of the daughter element d is given by where the line meets the y-axis. If d over d2 is not initially the same in all samples, the data points tend to scatter rather than falling in a straight line. For some radiometric dating techniques, the assumed initial conditions are reasonable. For example, KAR, which is potassium-argon dating, assumes that minerals form with no argon in them. Since argon is an inert gas, it will usually be excluded from forming crystals. This assumption can be tested by looking for argon in low potassium materials such as quartz, which would not contain substantial argon daughter products. 40 AR over 39 AR dating and K-AR isochron dating can also identify the presence of initial excess argon. The Concordia method is used on minerals, mostly zircon, which reject lead as they crystallize. Radiocarbon dating is based on the relative abundance of C14 in the atmosphere when a plant or animal lived. This varies somewhat, but calibrations with other techniques such as dendrochronology allows the variations to be corrected. Fission track dating assumes that newly solidified minerals will not have fission tracks in them. As far as constant decay rate in a closed system, absolutely closed systems do not exist even under ideal laboratory conditions. Nonetheless, many rocks approximate closed systems so closely that multiple radiometric dating methods produce consistent results within 1% of each other. It's pretty close. Some rocks may be open to outside contamination, but not all of them are. Most rocks are determined from multiple mineral and rock samples, which give a consistent date within 1 and 3%. It is extremely unlikely that contamination would affect all samples by the same amount. Isochron methods can detect contamination and to some extent correct for it. Isochrons are determined for multiple samples, and contamination would have to affect all of the samples the same way in order to create an isochron that appeared okay but was wrong.
It's important for you also to know that fossils cannot be dated directly with this type of dating method. You can't date fossils using radiometric dating.
We can date the layers they're found in. It would be very rare to find a 100-million-year-old fossil in a 1-million-year-old layer.
It is used to date igneous rocks, or what you might call volcanic rocks, and thereby determining the minimum age of the overlying sedimentary rocks, the rocks that fossils are found in.
Yes, what's the problem? This basic science you don't seem to understand.
But there have also been numerous published examples of flawed dates given by this method.
The only ones I know of were done by young Earth creationist scientists seeking to prove the world is young. They use flawed dating methods to collect the data and sent it to labs that stated they can't test the ages they were looking for anyway. As in, the labs can only test rocks older than 1 million years, and they were much younger. Please show me, and all my viewers, a real scientist making this claim, one without an agenda.
For example, when igneous rocks of the Grand Canyon were analyzed, different radiometric dating techniques rendered different dates.
Well, this seems to be another use the wrong method or use the correct one incorrectly type of things.
And one, you'll note here, the most accurate at the time, the rubidium-strontium isochron technique, gave a date for the Precambrian flow, the one on the bottom, that was hundreds of millions of years younger than the more recent flow that had cascaded over the rim of the Grand Canyon.
I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in this, but none of this is showing dates of 6,000 years old. I'd also like to know what time period this picture is from and when the test happened. A lot of advancements in science has happened even in the last few years.
First, number one, there is very little sediment on the seafloor for an Earth supposedly 4.6 billion years old. Yet the average thickness of all of these sediments globally over the whole seafloor is not even 1,300 feet. That's a net gain of about 19 billion tons per year. At this rate, 1,300 feet of sediments would accumulate in less than 12 million years, not billions of years. This evidence makes sense within the context of the global flood, not the idea of slow and gradual geologic evolution. In the latter stages of the year-long global flood, water swiftly drained off the emerging lands, dumping its sediment-choked loads offshore. Thus, most seafloor sediments accumulated rapidly only about 4,300 years ago.
Well, the thickness of sediment in the ocean varies greatly and is consistent with the age of an ocean floor. The thickness is zero at the mid-Atlantic ridge, where new ocean crust is forming, and there's about 150 million years worth of sediment at the margins. The average age of the ocean floor is much younger than the Earth due to subduction at some plate margins and formation of new crust at others. Subduction meaning one of the plates goes under the other plate and it melts and goes back into the Earth. Then on the other side, it's coming out and it's making new ocean floor. Science is cool. And again, from our friends, the age of the ocean floor can be determined in various ways. Radiometric dating, estimated from the measured rate of seafloor spreading as a result of plate tectonics, and estimated from the ocean depth that predicted from the seafloor sinking as it cools. All of these measurements are consistent and all fit with sediment thickness.
Number two, we also find bent rock layers that are inexplicable if these are truly ancient. Now, how can this happen if these layers were laid down separately over hundreds of millions of years and already hardened? But if concrete is still wet, it can easily be shaped and molded before the cement sets. The same principle applies to sedimentary rock layers. At some point, all of these layers were raised to the current elevation. Somehow, this whole sequence was bent and folded without fracturing. And note on the diagram the time difference between the first deposits at the Grand Canyon, the Tapete Sandstone, which was deposited 520 million years ago, and the conventionally accepted date of the bending, 70 million years ago. That's 450 million years later.
It's easily explained. Rock layers can bend without breaking when bent slowly and under pressure. I would think tens of millions of years counts as slow. It wasn't deposited recently during a global flood.
Number three, we find lots and lots of fossilized soft tissues.
The fact that you're even bringing this up shows you have no idea what you found and you don't understand it, or you're possibly lying. I'm not sure how one can get a degree in biology and stay young with creation. I'm also not sure how one gets a master's degree in education and teaches things so poorly. Maybe it would be a good idea to ask for a refund and give the degrees back.
A great many published discoveries of soft tissues like stomach contents and skin now exist that date by conventional methods well beyond 100 million years.
Scientists are not digging up dinosaurs with enough soft tissue to make a steak. They discover small amounts inside fossilized rocks that are rehydrated. And in fact, it's often not even actual flesh. It's markers of what used to be flesh that somehow survived over millions of years. Just because we don't know how it happened doesn't mean it didn't happen.
The preservation of skin, blood vessels, cells, and complex molecules is entirely consistent with the young Earth model and the rapid burial during the global flood, but it's highly implausible for organisms that supposedly died off millions of years ago.
Actually, it's the opposite of what would be true if the young Earth creationist model were real. If all of the dinosaurs really did die in a flood only 4,000 years ago or so, everything we dig up should be full of soft tissue, and not even soft tissue markers. I'm talking let's have a dinosaur steak. If medieval dragons were surviving dinosaurs, then we should be pulling them out of bogs, almost completely preserved. Jurassic Park should be a reality because the DNA would survive that short amount of time.
Let me give you one specific example. In 2005, a Tyrannosaurus rex was discovered in the Hell Creek Formation of Montana by North Carolina State University professor, paleontologist Dr. Mary Schweitzer.
Dr. Mary Schweitzer is a theistic evolutionist who's annoyed at people like you that hijack her research to make this claim. I left it in the video only to bring attention to it. These arguments are so old, I only have to go to one website, Talk Origins, to debunk everything. Seriously, if you're young Earth creationists, go to the link in the description, read a little bit every day. This entire video could just be me pointed to the website on the screen.
Well, since the T-Rex is believed to have gone extinct 65 million years ago, soft tissue was completely unexpected.
I think he meant completely. Don't worry, I mess up speaking all the time. If I could do this in one take, it would save me so much time in editing. Yes, this is how science works. Science had an idea. Soft tissue can't last 65 million years. DNA can't last 65 million years. It would be completely against all of what science does to just say, guess young Earth creationists is right, the Earth is 6,000 years old. Instead, they do science stuff, propose ideas for how this happened, and then test them. When one seems to be the most likely, it will become the new theory until some other discovery is made later.
Number 4 from our list of top 11 is what are called Lazarus bacteria.
Hey, finally one I haven't heard before. I've been waiting for something new.
This is another evidence for a young Earth that was discovered only in 2000. These were bacteria named Lazarus bacteria. The scientists claim to have resurrected bacteria that were found in salt crystals conventionally dated at 250 million years old. The scientists were tremendously surprised to find, upon their analysis, intact DNA was still present after 250 million supposed years. Well, DNA normally breaks down quickly, even in ideal conditions. Even evolutionists agree that DNA in bacterial spores, a dormant state of bacteria, should not last more than 1 million years.
Well, real scientists doing real science have studied how it happened. Big surprise, the bacteria are not really 4,000 years old. Seems from my research, these bacteria actually like salt water. They form spores in salt water, which preserve them.
They were moreover shocked that the bacterial's DNA was very similar to modern bacterial DNA. If the modern bacteria were the result of 250 million years of evolution, its DNA should be very different from the Lazarus bacteria DNA, based on known mutation rates.
Evolution is largely a product of its environment. If nothing changes, why would the bacteria? Bacteria in human bodies change because we keep trying to kill them.
Number 5, another indicator of a young Earth is the minimal amount of salt that is in the sea. See, every year, large amounts of salts are dumped into the oceans from rivers and glaciers and underground seepage and volcanic dust. An estimated 458 million tons of sodium is deposited into the ocean every year. Only 122 million tons, about 27% of what is deposited each year, is removed by natural processes. If seawater originally contained no sodium, no salt, and the sodium all accumulated at today's rates, then today's ocean's saltiness would be reached in only 42 million years.
Well, the following came from an article written by a Christian, so no, this is not evil atheists trying to cover up the truth. We have no indication that ocean levels are becoming more saltier. It goes up a little, it goes back down. Even if what they say is true and oceans do increase in saltiness, there's no indication it's at a uniform rate. In fact, oceans might have been much saltier in the past and become less saltier over the years.
But those assumptions failed to take into account the likelihood that God created a saltwater ocean for all the sea creatures when he made them on day 5.
Well, I mean, you're partly right. God set up a system that eventually resulted in saltwater oceans forming, but it was billions of years ago and not part of creation from nothing on day 5. Good thing he did, or they would all freeze in the winter. That and the big whales might have trouble swimming.
Also, the year-long global flood cataclysm must have dumped an unprecedented amount of salt to the ocean through erosion, sedimentation, and volcanism. So today's ocean saltiness makes much better sense within the biblical time scale of about 6,000 years.
Funny how the flood happened but didn't leave evidence. Funny how we see stars that are hundreds of thousands of light years away when they've only existed 6,000 years. Funny how everyone but Dr. Lyle abandoned coming up with a theory for this, and his only makes sense if you ignore everything else.
Well, our final evidence for young Earth comes from radiometric dating.
$5 says this evidence is from applying dating methods incorrectly, then saying it doesn't work. A lot of them have done this. It means they're either ignorant or lying. The Bible seems to be against lying.
Now, their number 6 is the existence of substantial helium found in rocks where radiometric decay has taken place that reveals that there's a major problem with one of the major assumptions of radiometric dating, and that is that radioactive atoms decay at constant rates.
They do decay at constant rates. If they all of a sudden decayed faster, we would have a major heat problem. I have heard them argue about helium before. My listeners seem to be smart. Let's skip the explanation and just get straight to the problem.
Well, radioactive elements will continue to decay, losing particles, becoming increasingly smaller atoms through what is called a decay series until they eventually become a stable element like lead.
And it takes much longer than 6,000 years for elements to decay into lead. You are kind of proving my point that you are always wrong for me.
Well, during the radioactive decay of elements like uranium and thorium, lots of helium is produced during their decay. Now, these radioactive elements can be found in crystals, but because helium is a tiny element, it readily diffuses or leaks out of crystals and eventually escapes into the atmosphere.
I know you like talking. Let's get to the point.
Well, a creation science research team called the RATE Group decided that helium measurements might be an alternative method for determining the date of rocks. Well, based on the assumption that the Earth was young...
I mean, it might have, if not for the faulty assumption. If this was happening 3,000 years ago, you could assume the Earth was young. We knew basically nothing about the age of the Earth, no geology, radioactivity, fossil records, nothing. Anyone making this assumption today has basically abandoned all science in favor of a faulty interpretation of an ancient text.
They decided to check to see if helium could be found in rocks. Samples of granite were obtained and analyzed by the RATE Group researchers from deep Precambrian, that is pre-flood granite rocks in New Mexico. From these rocks, they extracted samples of zircon crystals from different depths. Well, they analyzed the helium content of zircon crystals in granite. To their surprise, they found far more helium present in the zircons than expected, even assuming the rocks were young. In rock dated to 1.5 billion years old, up to 58% of the helium that the uranium could have ever generated in 1.5 billion years was still present in the crystals. When the helium diffusion rates at the various temperatures were plotted, the diffusivity of helium provided excellent confirmation of the predictions made by the young Earth model.
This is what Talk Origins has to say about this. Subsurface pressure and temperature conditions affect how quickly the helium diffuses out of zircons. Dr. Humphreys et al., we'll just refer to them as Dr. Humphreys from now on, selected a rock core sample from the Fenton Hills site, which Los Alamos National Laboratory evaluated in the 70s for geothermal production. The area is within a few kilometers of the valley's caldera, which has gone through several periods of faulting and volcanism. The rocks of the Fenton Hill core have been fractured, brecciated, and intruded by hydrothermal vents. Excess helium is present in the rocks. The helium may have contaminated the gneiss that Humphrey studied. In short, the entire region has had a very complex thermal history. Based on oil industry experience, it is essentially impossible to make accurate statements about the helium diffusion history of such a system. Scientific studies, especially those with radical implications, do not mean much until the results have been replicated by others. Many scientific claims have disappeared entirely when others could not get the same results. Confidence in this particular paper is reduced by several points. Most measurement errors and variabilities are not reported. Therefore, we do not know how accurate the results are. Humphreys claimed that they studied zircons and biotites from the depth of 750 and 1490 meters. However, Sasada showed that at these depths, the samples came from a gneiss, an entirely different rock type. Because of math errors, The Q over Q0 values, which is the fraction of helium retained, used by Humphreys to derive their dates, are too high. Humphreys failed properly to total their data in Appendix C, which means that they grossly underestimated the amount of helium released by their 750-meter deep zircons. The amount of helium in the zircons greatly exceeds the amount that would be expected from the radioactive decay of uranium over 1.5 billion years. The high helium concentration may be due to samples that were abnormally high in uranium and or due to the presence of excess helium. Much is made of the fact that samples 5 and 6 retain the same amount of helium, even though the amounts are probably at the limit of what could be measured. The possibility of measurement error accounting for the results is never mentioned. If one discounts sample 5, which is likely at the limit of what can be measured, the conclusions of Humphreys rest on just 3 samples. Such a small data set may be the basis for further research, but not for drawing conclusions. Humphreys et al. In note 9 referred to correcting apparent typographical errors in the raw data, casting suspicion on the validity of all the data.
Well, the excess helium present in those zircon crystals was interpreted by the rate group as indicating that accelerated nuclear decay had taken place.
Well, accelerating 4.5 billion years worth of radiometric decay into 6,000 years results in 4.5 billion years of heat occurring in 6,000 years. This also results in the Earth being vaporized, and last time I checked, the Earth was not vaporized.
The hourglass on the left illustrates the uranium on the top decaying into lead on the bottom.
Uranium does not decay into lead. It decays into elements that decay into other elements that eventually decay into lead. Many of these elements have half-lives of over 10,000 years. So this animation's not even worth watching.
The results suggest that at some point, God accelerated the nuclear decay process. But because the diffusion of helium out of the zircon crystals is a mechanical process, not a nuclear process, that rate was not affected.
God must have magicked away the heat problem, because even Humphreys has given up on figuring out the heat problem in this idea. I was going to say theory, but theories are testable and falsifiable, and this is not.
The decay of uranium occurred at a much faster rate, while the diffusion of helium occurred at a normal rate.
Okay, back to talk origins. If helium concentrations stay high around the rocks, it is possible for helium to diffuse into voids and fractures in the zircons, or at least high helium pressures could reduce the rate at which helium diffuses out. Either of these scenarios would invalidate the helium diffusion calculations by Humphreys. Helium concentrations within the Earth become high enough for commercial mining. The sample measured by Humphreys came from an area that is probably helium enriched. Helium deposits are common in New Mexico, and excess helium has been found just a few miles from where the sample was taken. To test for the presence of excess helium in their zircons, Humphreys should look for helium-3.
And at some point, the accelerated rate of nuclear decay returned to what we have today.
Another $5 says, why or how this happened will never be explained.
Now, I've often pondered this, the evidence of accelerated nuclear decay that they have found in these rocks in the fossil record. If there was accelerated nuclear decay happening during the global flood, which seems to be what we find, then that kind of begs a question.
It begs the question, how are you here thinking about it when the Earth had the heat equivalent of a few trillion hydrogen bombs exploding over every square inch of it? The only explanation is we were rescued by intelligent aliens that put us in a simulation, and they are laughing at the young Earth creationists for their ignorant theories.
If accelerated nuclear decay was taking place during the global flood, then it kind of begs a question whether the accelerated nuclear decay was a consequence. It's either going to be a consequence or a cause if it was happening during the flood.
I don't see any scientific reason why covering the land with water causes a change in radiometric decay.
According to geophysicists, the reason why the Earth's core is molten is because of the heat generated by nuclear decay.
That's one of three primary reasons. The other are leftover heat from the planetary formation and heat release as the liquid core solidifies near the border with its inner core. Is he really going to say the Earth's core was less molten before the flood?
What if you accelerated nuclear decay, caused massive heat to be generated in the interior of the Earth? Could that have broken the Earth apart, causing the global flood? I don't know. But it's an interesting thought that some geophysicists should pursue, in my thinking.
Well, geophysicists tend to pursue credible theories like any other good scientist. Why don't astronomers investigate if the moon is really made of cheese?
Well, in addition, the helium leakage rate from zircons has been determined in several experiments, which showed that helium diffuses so rapidly that all the helium in these zircon crystals should have leaked out into the atmosphere in less than 100,000 years.
Helium is a result of radiometric decay. Helium in rocks is not the only place it comes from. It also comes from the Earth's core. How convenient that your results, while wrong, match up with your beliefs.
Another evidence for a young Earth is the low amount of helium in the atmosphere. The leakage rate of helium gas into the atmosphere has been measured. Even though some helium escapes into outer space, the amount still present is not nearly enough if the Earth is 4.6 billion years old.
Helium is a very light atom, and some of the helium in the upper atmosphere can reach escape velocity just through temperature. Thermal escape of helium alone is not enough to account for its scarcity in the atmosphere, but helium also gets ionized and follows the Earth's magnetic field lines. When ion outflow is considered, the escape of helium from the atmosphere balances its production from radioactive elements.
In fact, if we assume no helium was in the atmosphere originally, all the helium would have accumulated in only 1.5 million years. But when the catastrophic flood upheaval is factored in, which rapidly released huge amounts of helium into the atmosphere, it could have accumulated in only 6,000 years.
So when including a thing that never happened, the timing is perfect. Solve the heat problem first, then try making a claim about accelerated nuclear decay.
Well, number 7, carbon-14 has been found in fossils, rocks, and diamonds, where it should not be.
C14 dating is only used on once living things. Living things absorb C14 from the atmosphere and stop when they die. Diamonds are not living and would not be dated with carbon-14 anyway. The amount found is less than the measurement error. It's essentially the same as having none. It's also a small enough amount to be considered contamination. Last, diamonds contain some nitrogen which can produce a small amount of C14. Let's skip ahead again. He just explains C14. Nitrogen can cause carbon in the atmosphere to decay. This is absorbed by plants and animals. It eventually decays back into nitrogen. We can then compare what is left to what was there before to get a date. This only works to about 55,000 years.
Well, these measurements are done using a device called an atomic mass spectrometer, shown here. The rate group that we talked about before had a number of samples of coal measured for carbon-14 content using this device. Unlike the other isotopes used in radiometric dating, carbon-14 decays very quickly, having a half-life of only 5,730 years. No carbon-14 is expected to remain in fossils after 100,000 years. The oldest samples that can be reliably measured by this process are 50,000 years old or less. Yet carbon-14 has been detected in ancient fossils, supposedly up to hundreds of millions of years old, ever since the earliest days of radiocarbon dating.
The rate group is notoriously sloppy when gathering samples. I talked before about finding C14 in old samples. Contamination is the biggest, either from forward gathering, leftovers in the machine, and nearby radiometric decay. It is such a small amount, any scientist would ignore it.
In fact, between 1984 and 1998 alone, the secular scientific literature reported carbon-14 in 70 samples that came from fossils, coal, oil, natural gas, and marble, representing the fossil-bearing portion of the geological record supposedly spanning more than 500 million years.
0.1 to 0.7% does not seem like a lot of carbon. If these samples really were 6,000 years old, shouldn't that number be higher?
Further analysis of fossilized wood and coal samples supposedly spanning 32 to 350 million years in age yielded dates between 20,000 and 50,000 years using carbon-14 dating.
Funny how using the wrong test on something gives the wrong results.
Coal for carbon-14 content is that such materials are prone to contamination.
And are you going to explain how the rate study corrected for this, or still claim a diamond is young?
Coal is a porous material. Stuff can leach into it, leach out. So the rate group decided to test for carbon-14 in diamonds, which can be thoroughly treated to remove contaminants.
Unless, like previously stated, it's contaminated while formed. Next.
The rate group found that diamonds, supposedly 1 to 3 billion years old, yielded carbon-14 ages of only 55,000 years.
55,000 years is the upper limit for dating anyway. You are not proving anything. And 55,000 is famously much larger than 6,000 years old. If 25,000 diamonds from all corners of the earth were tested by non-young earth creationist scientists, and they all had an age around 6,000 years, you might have a point.
This date is excessively old according to the Bible, but we need to recognize that there are serious problems with the assumption of this dating technique as well.
None of which has been covered in this video so far, and we are almost to the end. This is a classic young earth creationist thing to do. Say a lot about how things are wrong and then ignore them. Also, why does it work okay when supposedly gives you dates you like, but stops working when it gives you dates you don't like?
High carbon-14 quantities in ancient pre-flood samples is very likely due to the fact that the magnetic field has decayed over time and was stronger in the past.
There is zero, I repeat, zero evidence that the magnetic field is steadily decaying. It does not have a half-life like other radioactive materials do. It's caused by the motion of the Earth's core, and it fluctuates over time. Sometimes it weakens enough that it reverses.
Protecting the atmosphere from solar radiation and reducing the radiocarbon production before the flood. As a result, plants and animals incorporated less radiocarbon into their cells before the flood, and their deaths occurred much more recently than expected. So the radiocarbon ages of all fossils and coals should be reduced to less than 5,000 years, matching the timing of their burial during the flood. The age of diamonds should be reduced to approximately the time of the biblical creation, about 6,000 years ago.
I sometimes wish I could live in a fantasy world like this. Imagine just being able to declare that chocolate cake and ice cream are completely healthy and eat as much as you want. Well, everyone, we have reached the end of the second video in this series. I hope that you learned something. I hope you liked it. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe. In fact, if you don't like it, please hit the like button and subscribe. Until next time, I have plenty of other videos on my channel, so why don't you stick around a bit and enjoy. I have a feeling he's going to get as in the lab can only test the helium may have been contaminated. Funny how using the wrong result. Funny how